Things change pretty quickly in the world of fantasy football. So, what are the best strategies for 2024? That's what we're here to talk about on today's Audible. Cecil, Lammey, Sigmund, Bloom, and we've kind of teased this during the show, during the entire year. Bloom, it's like, all right, it's a little different than it used to be with running backs. Let's start there.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to know going into 2024 fantasy drafts for running back is, once again, running backs are cheaper than you're used to. The dead zone, running backs that are in the 4th, 5th round in previous years, running backs that might be getting touches by default. Well, they're the best running back in a backfield, but in a lot of backfields they wouldn't be, and you wonder if they'll get overtaken. Those running backs, veteran running backs on the back nine of their career, like James Conner and company, those running backs are in the 7th and 8th round. Those guys used to cost 4th, 5th round picks. Even some of the first round running backs. Again, you're going to see running back number 1, Christian McCaffrey, and then probably not another running back until the 6th or 7th pick. And then maybe 6 running backs in the first 18 or 20 picks. So this is going to allow you to get your anchor running back later and to get your complementary running backs later. So don't feel urgency to take running backs because everybody's been burned. And see, this is something that we have to keep in our the back of our mind for all this stuff. What worked last year and what didn't work last year is going to be heavy in the minds of all the fantasy football drafters.
Right.
So that means that I did an episode with Pete Overzet on the couch in June when we talked about this. If you're doing what would have worked last year, you're going to be with the crowd. So you need to zig when they're zagging. So you need to incorporate into your strategy. Well, a lot of people are going to be doing this. So actually the inefficiency is going to be going with the crowd. And I think that when we look at what worked last year for individual players, what worked for individual positions, we need to know that, well, everybody's going to know that. So where's the edge? The edge is going counter to that.
The edge is the opposite of that. And well, first off, I guess I should have started. Know your scoring in lineups.
Yeah.
Because if you're super flex and you can start 2 quarterbacks, you're taking 2 quarterbacks.
Right.
Like, always know that. If there's a tight end premium, know that. But if there's not, Bloom, and you only start 1 tight end per week, you don't have to take tight end too early. You
Right.
do somewhat early based
Right.
on the position, but you don't have to spend the premium pick on tight end.
You don't. And here's why. There's not a consensus on who the number 1 tight end is, really. And there's a large pool of players who could be the number 1 tight end this year. Sam Laporta is going off of the board as the number 1 tight end. He's in his second year. He's probably should be the favorite to finish number 1 because he's going to get even better. He's in a good offense. But there's Trey McBride entering year 3 with a healthier Kyler Murray, with Marvin Harrison Jr. Maybe that's good for Trey McBride. Maybe defenses focus so much on him that Trey McBride is left open even more often. You've got, of course, Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. I think that these guys were number 1 and number 2 for so many years, and last year was disappointing, but maybe there's an overreaction here by having them drop so much. And then there's Dalton Kincaid. And I think Dalton Kincaid is the right answer if we say who's going to lead the Bills in catches and yards this year. Now, by how much or how primary of a target will he be? He could be number 1 tight end. So what that tells me, Cease, is I'm comfortable saying, y'all in my league, y'all take the first 4 tight ends. Take whichever 4 you want. Give me the 5th tight end. If it's Kelce, if it's Andrews, if it's Kincaid, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with whichever one y'all leave for me. That's the sweet spot. And if you do miss out, that's a great strategy. But what happens if someone takes the number 5 10 and right in front of me? Well, how do you feel about Kyle Pitts? How do you feel about David Njoku? How do you feel about Evan Ingram? I mean, these are guys. George Kittle. He's the 7th tight end off the board. He usually finishes in the top 3 to 5. So be patient at tight end, even if somehow you miss out on all of those guys. Jake Ferguson is a value where he's going, even later in your draft. A guy like Luke Musgrave with Tucker Kraft having that injury, uh, putting his training camp in doubt. There are options at every point in the way, but I do think you can get an elite tight end at a less than elite price.
Yeah, they're slashing prices. And I'll tell you this, look at Handcuff differently than you used to. As someone who loved to grab that extra running back, your waiver wire is your handcuff now.
Mhm.
That's just work your waiver wire strategy. We emphasize that a lot. Be an early adopter, like get it out there, because sometimes handcuff can actually handcuff you.
Sure.
And I bring that up because you mentioned Mark Andrews. I'm like, well, I'm just going to take Isaiah Likely. I'll be out of the Andrews market, but all right, you're looking at backups, whatever position. Just be careful how much you're tying teams together, especially if it's bad or average offenses.
I think that your point about not drafting for depth and not using your bench spots for depth is a really important one because depth should be the residue of good drafting, good waiver wire moves, good roster management. You want to draft for ceiling. You want to use those spots for ceiling. And Isaiah Likely actually qualifies for both
Mhm.
because that ceiling, as I've loved pointing out, Isaiah Likely, when he was the starter, actually had more fantasy points per game in a PPR league than Mark Andrews had when he was the starter last year. So that's pretty exciting. Isaiah Likely as the number one tight end for the Ravens can be the number one fantasy tight end. So I think that he's this rare case where you are incorporating upside and depth into your roster, into your bench by having him. But overall, if you're taking players that have limited ceilings, but like, hey, if I need to turn to them in a bye week or if there's an injury or some sort of emergency, I've got at least a high floor depth player. Forget about the floor. You're concerned with the ceiling.
Yeah, you're concerned with the ceiling, you're concerned with the upside, and you're concerned with quarterback. And again, no, you're scoring in lineups, but more standard leagues with your quarterback, and you're starting one a week. You don't have to get the top ones because, well, should we just mention this is the Dak section?
Right?
Let's talk about Dak Prescott in this
Sure.
section with quarterback strategy.
Right. Let's talk about Dak, baby. Uh, Look, Josh Allen is the number one quarterback off the board, but he had a prodigious run of rushing touchdowns. In the Joe Brady offense, if he didn't have 15 rushing touchdowns last year, we wouldn't be looking at him as the number one quarterback. And that was not something that we just assumed. This isn't like the tush push. Oh, speaking of the tush push, Jalen Hurts, new offensive coordinator. Jason Kelsey retired. Maybe Jalen Hurts isn't getting the same kind of looks at the goal line as he was getting, even shaving 3, 4, 5 of those off and giving those to Saquon Barkley, a pretty formidable back in his own right. Now Jalen Hurts isn't so attractive. Patrick Mahomes is in the top 3 on respect, but he was nowhere near the top 3 last year. You really want to try that again? Now, I'm not going to talk anybody out of Lamar Jackson as the fourth quarterback. I think this offense could reach new heights. I do think Lamar Jackson could be a league winner, but he's only going like a round after those first 3. You're not even getting much of a Lamar Jackson discount. Where you are getting the discount, and then the next guy's off the board, C.J. Stroud, Anthony Richardson, and like Jackson, Richardson could be a league winner this year. He also might only play 3 games like he did last year. Then you get to the sweet spot. Dak Prescott, after the bye week adjustments, was the number 2 fantasy quarterback. Kyler Murray coming back off of an ACL tear, second year now, in a better offense under Drew Petzing, where he was starting to seeming to get it as the season went on last year. And oh, by the way, you add Marvin Harrison Jr. You add a true number 1 wide receiver for him. Jordan Love. Why not Jordan Love? Jordan Love in the second half of the year was a top 7, top 8 fantasy quarterback, and all of his pieces of his offense are all young, getting better. That's good. That's a good thing, right? We even talk about Caleb Williams in this tier, Cease, because any quarterback that's throwing to DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen, yeah, and the offensive line is better. And Caleb Williams can produce as a scrambler outside of structure too. So I think we have 4 quarterbacks there that all have top 5 upside. And in the case of Prescott, he already demonstrated last year that against this pool of quarterbacks, he can stand out. You don't need to take a quarterback early this year.
What's funny is you look at coaches that are on the hot seat, and I do believe Sean McDermott is on the hot seat. That's why they're taking the ball away from Josh Allen. So they can control it and they can be super conservative, and Josh can't run wild, and the rushing touchdowns will not be the same. We know that. And then we look at Chicago with Caleb. It's like, no, Caleb, go save my job.
Right.
So there's also an awareness of like which teams will be either desperate to shackle their quarterback like Josh Allen will be, or which team is desperate, which will like, go, please save us, Caleb. Save us, Caleb. That could be really good news for you grabbing Caleb Williams as your
Yeah.
second quarterback.
Right. Or Dak Prescott again, because
Mm-hmm.
Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle are not walking through that door as the saviors of this offense. It is going to be all on Dak Prescott's shoulders. That's another reason to really like him as someone that's going to outproduce that ADP. But Cecil, I think you're right. And look, again, I'll say, oh, well, what if all these quarterbacks go ahead of you? Jared Goff doesn't play his first outdoor game until week 9, and then he doesn't play his second outdoor game until week 16. So usually Jared Goff is part of a quarterback by committee where you're just playing him when he's indoors or just playing him when he's in Detroit. You don't really need that second quarterback until the fantasy playoffs. Yeah, that's kind of important. But hey, you have 3 or 4 months to figure out who is worthy of those starts if you're scared of Jared Goff outdoors.
Yeah, fantasy football is not just the draft. It's a complete package. It's the waiver wire, it's trades during the year. Like, yeah, you can start things with a bit of a weak spot if you have to, based on the way that you draft, but you can turn that into a strength with work. Yes, fantasy football is work during the season. I just blew everybody's mind. Like, oh God, I don't want to work.
Right.
Let's wrap up today's program with a discussion about, well, wide receivers, because there's a lull after the rush of wide receivers, and wide receiver value is crazy. You are buying wide receivers at much higher prices than we're used to seeing. So again, counterculture, how do you go counter that? Well, depending on your scoring in the lineup, you may not be able to, Bloom, but at the
Right.
wide receiver position, you got to pay the price, and then be careful where you pay the price after that.
Yeah, I think in the first round, I understand going wide receiver because, especially if you're picking in the first half of the first round, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, I am in Ross St. Brown. Even in the second half of the first round, AJ Brown was on quite a tear last year. And then in the second round is maybe where you can take your Jonathan Taylor or Saquon Barkley, even Devin Achane, because the second round, I think the most important strategy chip I'm going to tell you is that second round wide receivers really have third round value, but there were no second round value wide receivers this year. So Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Chris Olave, Brandon Ayuk, these guys have scoring profiles that usually go in the third round in fantasy football drafts. But this year, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, this year they're pushed up into the second round because there's just a gap there. So that might be a better round to go running back. And then really you have flexibility as you go through your draft, and you should have specific individual targets, but your wide receiver strategy doesn't have to be tied to taking wide receivers in certain rounds. There are positions we can say like, hey, round 7 and 8, that's a sweet spot for quarterback. Round 4 or 5, that's probably a sweet spot for tight end. Running back also has a sweet spot around the 7th, 8th, 9th round. Wide receiver, there's possibilities throughout your draft. So you might break ties against wide receiver as you go through your draft, except in the first round.
Yeah, except then, because you got to pay that price. Got to pay the price to watch this show. It's free, so you
Oh,
got to help us out, please. And the way that you help us out is liking and commenting and sharing and subscribing to this channel. Subscribe to all of our Football Guys channels, the Audible and Fantasy Football and Dynasty. We've got it all covered for you. And then some. It is Football Guys on YouTube. Subscribe to us all. Check out our free daily newsletter. That's at footballguys.com. And then if you want to support the show, we don't do any silly super chats. So how about you subscribe to footballguys.com? Well, we're there to help you
Mhm.
win your league. That's what footballguys.com has been about for, are we coming up on 30 years?
25.
25
25
years.
years. We gotta plan
25
some
years.
stuff. Oh, man. This is supposed to be a private conversation. What are we
Ha,
doing for our 25th anniversary?
right. And what are we doing next year for the Audible's 20th anniversary? We'll leave you to wonder on that. But how about this? Follow Sigmund Bloom on Twitter, X at Sigmund Bloom. I'm at Cecil Lammey. The show's at The Audible. We're saying thanks for watching. Stay tuned. And would you please stay frosty?